Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and you knew Robert was going to get at least one more new core out before the Christmas break, and it is here today. It's brought some improvements as well as some new working games that aren't in the retail library but have been released for the Nintendo 64, so it's always great to see new games working. And right off the top, Xeno Crisis is a spectacular game that exists on many systems and it did just recently get a port to the Nintendo 64, but because of the SDK that it used for development, which was more modern than what Nintendo had, it did not function 100% correctly on the Nintendo 64 MiSTer FPGA core. Robert in the background dealt with that SDK and how it functions and was able to make improvements to the core to get Xeno Crisis now running, which is absolutely amazing. And if you want to grab this game, Bitmap Bureau does sell ROMs on their website, the developers of the game. I highly suggest you throw them a couple bucks and get an official copy. I've got it on Neo Geo and Neo Geo CD as well as Nintendo 64. It's an amazing game. You definitely should check it out. Not sponsored, I just really like what those guys do over there. But having this on the Nintendo 64 core is another game that we get to play now that we've gotten 100% compatibility with the retail library. Because there are a lot of different fan games and reproductions and things such as that that run on real Nintendo 64 hardware that might utilize some function in Nintendo 64 silicon itself that no retail game ever saw. It could be an address space, it could be a register, or any other function that maybe just no retail game ever utilized, but new development for the Nintendo 64 could, because this game was developed with LibDragon, which is a more modern SDK, which implements a lot of quality of life features and different ways to do things that they didn't have back in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s when people were developing for Nintendo 64. So Robert took upon himself to make sure that the core could function with some of these games as well, which would not be at all required to have a 100% complete core for retail games, but it's awesome he goes the extra mile. And again, Xeno Crisis is such an awesome game, and I really do like playing it here on the Nintendo 64. It is very difficult though, get prepared to die a lot. It takes a minute to get used to the controls on a Nintendo controller versus every other system, but I do like what it does visually with the Nintendo 64 and all the different VI implementations. It has a slightly softer look to the graphics. I think that really works well within the game itself and the world of Xeno Crisis. But this is only the second best game on Nintendo 64, starting with an X. The first game definitely has to be Xeno Warrior Princess. All jokes aside, people did request this game and I've been waiting to test it, and the perfect moment was to go from Xeno Crisis to Xeno Warrior Princess. I am going to say that this game definitely is not without its charms, but I'm sure if you're a fan of the show, you're going to find a lot more to love here, because outside of Xena, I have absolutely no idea who any of these people are. I didn't watch the show back in the day, but I know it was popular for a lot of different reasons with a lot of different groups. But as we actually get into the game, again, it's another game that's 100% working. There aren't a ton of fighting games on the Nintendo 64, and there aren't a ton of fighting games that take place in a completely 3D environment. So this is actually relatively impressive because it runs at a good frame rate, while also having relatively detailed models on screen that do look like their counterparts from the television show. And that was not a guarantee at all back in the Nintendo 64 days. Even some of this pseudo lighting here, it all runs at a very nice frame rate, but it's not the most fun fighting game ever to play. It's definitely very spammy if you want to win a match. It seems like one of those games that the developers had a very good technical sense of the hardware and were able to get a lot of performance out of what was there on tap. It seems like maybe they weren't the best at developing a 3D fighting game though, and that does happen sometimes where you have really technically talented developers that don't get the gameplay 100% correctly. This is definitely not going to rival anything like Soul Calibur on Dreamcast anytime soon, but it's another example of a game that's running really well on the core, and because a lot of you did ask for a request on this one as far as testing was concerned, I figured we'd add it in here. But I do have some more work to do. I'm going to make some more testing videos, so leave me a comment down below and tell me what game I haven't covered yet on the channel that you want to see. But again, this is a really good technical showcase of what the Nintendo 64 was capable of. You have the perspective correct textures, you have the models, you have all of the arenas, and they're all running at a good frame rate. And that's not something you see on the Nintendo 64 very often. And it's got a pretty interesting soundtrack as well, so go ahead and listen for 45 seconds and I'll come back and show you more games that just work.
Fight!
Definitely lost there, but I don't know what I'm doing in Xeno, so that's about as good as it's going to get, but it does have a fun soundtrack. Now, another game that people have been requesting for like 2 months now, and I keep forgetting to do, and I am sorry, is Rocket Robot on Wheels. There must be a lot of nostalgia for this game because I do see a lot of requests checking out whether or not it works on the core. I'm happy to say it 100% does work, and this seems to be perfect, but I will tell you right now, I have never played this game before outside of testing the Nintendo 64 core. I didn't play it back in the day, it's not in my collection, it's nothing I've ever come across, which is actually kind of fun for me too to experience the game for the first time on MiSTer FPGA that I've never once played in real life outside of these tests. It's a very interesting and intriguing game, and there definitely is something here. I probably need to get further into the game to better understand what it's asking of me, and that clown rolling around on a beach ball is definitely terrifying if you don't like clowns, but it is a very intriguing premise, and as far as 3D platformers are concerned, you're definitely spoiled for choice on Nintendo 64, but if you've already played all of the other games, the Super Mario 64s, the Banjo Kazooies and Tooies of the world, all of the Bomberman games, and you have stuff like Rocket Robot on Wheels left over to give you that sort of fix. And I will say that I definitely want to get further into this one, but tell me down below if you played this back in the day. I would be curious. There's all these little mini games and throwing mechanics, and it feels like the developers were trying to do a lot here. There's a lot of collectibles, kind of feels like a robotic Banjo Tooie for lack of any better game to compare it to. And I love that you have to try to feed the US presidents on Mount Rushmore apples in their mouth. I hit that shot, but it definitely came back out, and that just does not feel fair. But again, this just seems to be exactly like real hardware would. I did check out some real hardware video before I started talking about this because my familiarity with the game is absolutely zero, and it does seem like maybe it's actually running a little bit better here. And I know a lot of people have asked about what improvements might come to the core towards the end. There's definitely situations in which the core will outperform the Nintendo 64, so I'm sure in the end, once it gets closer to hardware accurate, you may see some slowdown in the games that matches the hardware, but there's probably going to be some options to make the Nintendo 64 run faster than it would on a real cart on a real hardware implementation in your living room, and that's definitely going to be awesome to see. Now, another game that everyone wanted to see retested that I haven't checked out since one of the beginning cores here is the original San Francisco Rush. I've shown a lot of Rush 2 and Rush 2049, but I hadn't looked at the original San Francisco Rush outside of the one core where it was running at like 8 frames a second, had a lot of graphical glitches. This is now the San Francisco Rush that everyone remembers and a lot of people loved on Nintendo 64. Now, compared to the arcade original, this is not the best port. It definitely doesn't run anywhere near as fast, and the controls and driving feel a little bit off in this version compared to the original arcade board. But this is still a ton of fun to play on the core, and this is vastly improved since the last time I looked at it. Just because 100% of the retail games launched does not mean they're all playable. The last time we took a look at this, like I said, all of the graphics were pretty much corrupted. It was running at maybe 4 to 6 frames per second. And if you can't tell already, it's a lot better than it used to be. But if there's a game that I tested in the beginning series of these videos, let me know down below and I'll definitely check it out to see how it's done. But the soundtrack to San Francisco Rush, very interesting. Listen and I'll be right back. You might notice that explosion did clip out the audio channels ever so slightly, and I did lower the volume down by 12 decibels in DaVinci Resolve, but that is something that happens on real hardware too. For some reason, the audio on San Francisco Rush seems to be unbalanced, and some of the sound effects are going to come across clipping out. Not sure if that's just the sound sample rate that's doing that, or if there's some issue with the actual volume levels in the game code. But if you hear that on your core, just be aware that that is something that can happen on real hardware too, and I have no idea how I avoided that explosion right there. By all rights, that Volkswagen bus should have exploded into a fiery mess, and the meat wagon should have been called. Now, another game that everyone's been asking me to test and I've never checked out is Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. I remember playing this game back in the day on my PC, and I'm going to say right now, that is where it should have stayed. I don't knock games on the channel, but the control scheme for this makes it very difficult to actually play this effectively. This is definitely a keyboard and mouse style game versus trying to play on a Nintendo 64 controller. Now, of course, I haven't played Rainbow Six since like the late 90s or early 2000s, so I am ever so slightly rusty. Actually, I realize that's not true. I did play Rainbow Six Vegas on the Xbox 360, and I did enjoy the hell out of that game. Maybe I'll actually have to get a replay on that one. But here on the Nintendo 64, it is functioning exactly as it's intended, and if you can wrap your head around what the control scheme's actually asking of you, you might have some fun with this one. It's just one of those things though where not every single first-person shooter is going to be able to translate to the Nintendo 64 controller. Something like Doom 64 was custom made for the Nintendo 64, and the developers took a lot of time thinking about how the control scheme would work on this hardware. On something like Rainbow Six with all the different things to do, it can be quite hard, and I accidentally threw that flashbang right there. But again, I should have been paying a little bit more attention. But honestly, as you walk forward trying to see what's going on the Nintendo 64 hardware with the Nintendo 64 controller can be quite difficult. This is a game where you really need to be stealthy and sneak around, but because of the slight blurriness of Nintendo 64 graphics that are inherent to the hardware setup, it can be very difficult to even spot the enemies that you're trying to walk towards. I had no idea I was in the line of fire here, but you can definitely see it did not work out well for me. But you guys wanted to see it, and I can tell you it works. But the big takeaway from this core update is that some of the homebrew games for Nintendo 64 are starting to work, Xeno Crisis being the big one, and that is awesome because this is as good as any retail game that came out on the Nintendo 64 back when it was on retail store shelves, and I can't wait to see what other fan games are going to start to work later on down the line. But that's the current situation with the Nintendo 64 core. It was updated yesterday and you get a video today, and I'm guessing probably maybe, at least for my own sanity and work schedule, that we're not going to see another core update until after the Christmas holiday, but you never know what Robert has planned. He said one game playable by Christmas. We now have the entire retail library plus one game playable in Xeno Crisis, and honestly there's a ton of different fan ROMs that work, but my joke didn't work if I didn't say it that way. But you guys, the Nintendo 64 core keeps getting better. Go play some Xeno Crisis, play some more games, leave me some requests down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.